June 12, 1944. Morning mist clings to the hedgerows of Normandy. The air is damp, thick with the scent of wet earth and distant gunpowder. Through the haze, the silhouettes of Sherman tanks and jeeps crawl along muddy tracks, their engines thrumming in unison like a mechanical heartbeat. American convoy lines stretch beyond the eye, endless ribbons of steel and rubber ferrying ammunition, food, and fuel toward the front. Behind barbed wire, a small group of German officers stand silently. Their uniforms are worn, faces streaked with dirt and disbelief. They had expected chaos, perhaps even surrender. Instead, they witness a spectacle of organized, unstoppable power. Supply trucks roll past without pause, drivers focused, radios crackling in precise rhythm. Each convoy a lifeline for the men who will fight and survive another day. These officers, seasoned in the art of war, realize in that moment something their intelligence never prepared them for. The Americans fight not only with courage and weapons, but with the invisible strength of logistics. The war, they begin to understand, is already tilting beyond their control, and yet the human eyes before them still reflect a quiet, stunned awe. The endless flow of supply would define the battles yet to come, shaping both strategy and fate. By the summer of 1944, the Allied forces had amassed an unprecedented armada along the southern coast of England. Operation Overlord, the code name for the invasion of Normandy, was more than a military maneuver. It was a colossal test of planning, engineering, and logistics. From London to Portsmouth, hundreds of thousands of men, tens of thousands of vehicles, and an endless stream of supplies were carefully orchestrated, each detail timed to the minute. The Americans, British, and Canadians would converge on the Normandy beaches with the precision of a well-oiled machine, ready to crack the Atlantic wall that Germany had spent years fortifying. For the Germans, the situation was dire. The Wehrmacht had concentrated its forces along the French coastline, relying on fixed fortifications, minefields, and artillery positions to repel any invasion. Yet, despite formidable defenses at places like Omaha, Utah, Gold, and Juno beaches, intelligence reports underestimated the scale of the Allied supply effort. The Germans anticipated fierce fighting, but assumed logistical bottlenecks would slow the Allies. What they did not predict was the continuous flow of fuel, ammunition, and rations that could sustain armored divisions far inland, day after day, without pause. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, American engineers worked tirelessly to convert captured or requisitioned ports into functioning supply hubs. Every pier, warehouse, and road was inspected, repaired, and fortified. Convoys of trucks, often numbering in the hundreds, would snake across the countryside, protected by anti-aircraft units and coordinated with meticulous radio discipline. Meanwhile, airborne divisions prepared to secure key bridges and crossroads, ensuring that supply lines would remain uninterrupted. The logistical challenge was monumental. Yet the Allies approached it as a scientific problem, one they could solve with manpower, ingenuity, and organization. The German officers captured in Normandy would later recount their initial disbelief. They had studied maps, reviewed intelligence, and inspected reconnaissance photos. Yet nothing could have prepared them for the sight of continuous convoy lines threading through the French countryside, a river of American efficiency and industrial might. Sherman tanks, jeeps, and half-tracks moved almost effortlessly despite the chaos of war, carrying the tools, weapons, and provisions needed to sustain combat operations far beyond the beaches. Every convoy was a statement. The Americans had not only landed, they had arrived to stay. While the Germans had fortified their defenses, the Americans relied on mobility and adaptability. Engineers constructed temporary bridges over bombed-out roads, repaired shell-cratered highways, and implemented traffic control measures that allowed vehicles to flow with minimal delay. Fuel depots were established just behind the front lines, ensuring that tanks never ran dry and artillery units remained operational. Even in the rain and mud, American drivers pressed forward, undeterred, delivering the essential lifeblood of war to soldiers already entrenched in fierce combat. The contrast could not have been starker. German troops were trained to anticipate ambushes and chaos, yet they encountered an invading force whose backbone was methodical, organized, and relentless. The captured officer's shock was compounded by the realization that this war, unlike previous conflicts, would be won not merely by valor on the battlefield, but by the invisible strength of supply chains stretching from the factories of the United States to the muddy fields of Normandy. In that moment, the Axis realized that the industrial and logistical war, the war behind the front lines, had already been lost. The enormity of the Allied preparation set the stage for a confrontation that would test the limits of human endurance, strategy, and the sheer weight of organized industrial power. By mid-June 1944, the Normandy coastline was a landscape transformed by battle. Beaches were pocked with craters from naval bombardments, hedgerows torn open by artillery, and abandoned German defenses littered with barbed wire and tank traps. Amid this chaos, the American logistical machine moved like clockwork, turning what might have been disorder into sustained momentum. Convoys of jeeps, half-tracks, and trucks threaded through narrow, shell-damaged roads, their drivers braving artillery fire, sudden ambushes, and treacherous terrain to deliver fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies directly to frontline units. The captured German officers observed these movements with a mixture of disbelief and growing apprehension. Their intelligence reports had assumed that Allied supply lines would be slow, vulnerable, and easily disrupted. Instead, they witnessed unbroken chains of vehicles advancing with precision, often under the cover of smoke and fog, and protected by units specifically tasked with securing supply routes. Each convoy was a lifeline, carrying not just the necessities of war but also the symbolic message of inexhaustible capacity. The Americans were not merely fighting, they were sustaining an army capable of relentless pressure. American engineers played a crucial role in this feat. They constructed temporary pontoon bridges over bombed-out rivers, repaired shell-damaged roads under fire, and established forward supply depots that allowed frontline units to remain combat effective. Communications teams maintained constant coordination, using radio networks to prevent traffic jams, reroute damaged vehicles, and respond to emergencies instantly. In every respect, the logistical apparatus functioned as a silent but decisive weapon, often unseen by the enemy yet critical to every tactical advance. The German officers' shock extended beyond the material. They saw morale bolstered in American troops, nourished by the constant presence of supplies and the knowledge that reinforcements were never far behind. Soldiers moving alongside supply convoys were relatively well-fed, armed and rested compared to the beleaguered Axis defenders, who were increasingly exhausted and running low on essential equipment. The difference in endurance became starkly visible. American troops could rotate through the front lines with support continuously arriving, while German units struggled with dwindling resources and the weight of defensive attrition. Beyond the practical, the scene revealed a deeper truth about the nature of modern war. Industrial capacity, efficient supply, and operational planning could dictate outcomes as decisively as any battlefield maneuver. For the Germans, it became evident that the fight in Normandy was not only against individual soldiers or tanks, but against a system, a vast, coordinated effort linking American factories, ports, and roads directly to the front. It was a revelation that would haunt them for the remainder of the campaign. No amount of tactical skill could compensate for the overwhelming logistical advantage the Allies had achieved. Even amidst combat's chaos, the Americans' use of standardized procedures, meticulous planning, and unrelenting execution allowed them to sustain advances day after day. Tanks remained fueled, artillery shells replenished, medical care available, all moving in perfect harmony with the tactical goals set by commanding officers. For the German officers observing from their temporary captivity, this combination of human discipline and industrial might made clear that the war in Western Europe had entered a new phase. It was no longer merely a contest of armies, but a contest of enduring capacity, foresight, and organizational resilience. By the end of June 1944, it was undeniable. The logistical superiority of the Allies was reshaping Normandy itself, and the Axis forces faced not just defeat on the battlefield, but the slow, inexorable erosion of their ability to fight back. The faces of the German officers in Normandy reflected shock, disbelief, and mounting dread. They were men trained to command, to read the battlefield, and to anticipate enemy weaknesses. Yet here in the French countryside, they encountered a reality that defied expectations. Exhaustion, hunger, and fear were commonplace among the Axis troops, but the Americans displayed a relentless energy, sustained not by luck or raw courage alone, but by the tireless support of their logistical networks. Observing soldiers moving with steady purpose, aided by unbroken lines of supply trucks and artillery crews receiving constant replenishment, the Germans realized that morale was as much a product of supply as of spirit. Each convoy, each delivered crate of food or shell of ammunition, became a lifeline that kept the Americans operational and psychologically resilient. From a tactical standpoint, the relentless supply lines were more than a background detail. They shaped every engagement. German units could not predict when, where, or how the Americans would strike, because each attack was backed by assured resupply. Armor could be committed knowing fuel was available. Infantry assaults could sustain momentum because ammunition flowed without interruption. Every defensive plan crafted by German commanders was undermined by the adaptability that logistics granted the Americans. The constant threat of reinforcements and resupply forced the Axis into reactive positions, stretching their lines thin and creating gaps that could be exploited. Normandy became a chessboard where the Germans played with limited pieces, while the Americans moved with an almost inexhaustible hand. The technological infrastructure underpinning these supply chains was staggering. American factories on the home front produced thousands of vehicles, weapons, and tons of fuel daily. Standardized trucks like the GMC CCKW Deuce and a Half carried vast quantities of supplies across war-torn terrain, while modular pontoon bridges and prefabricated Bailey bridges allowed engineers to repair rivers and destroyed roads swiftly. Radios connected supply depots with frontline units, enabling real-time rerouting and prioritization. Every tank, every artillery shell, every ration reflected a system designed to overcome the friction of war. To German eyes, the speed and efficiency of these operations seemed almost superhuman, an endless flow of materials and manpower that could not be stalled by conventional tactics. American commanders, from company officers to generals, understood the power of this logistical advantage and leveraged it fully. Operational planning accounted not only for enemy positions, but also for the continuous movement of supply vehicles. Commanders like General Omar Bradley emphasized coordination between frontline units and supply lines, ensuring that no soldier advanced unsupported. The German officers, accustomed to exploiting logistical weaknesses, found their expectations shattered. Every anticipated disruption had already been anticipated and neutralized. Leadership on the Allied side harmonized industrial might and battlefield execution into a seamless, almost unassailable strategy. The human resilience, tactical ingenuity, industrial capacity, and leadership cohesion observed in Normandy left the captured German officers questioning the very nature of modern warfare. For the German officers captured during the Normandy campaign, the sight of endless American convoy lines was both alien and alarming. They had trained for rapid maneuvers, blitzkrieg-style breakthroughs, and calculated counterattacks. Yet the Americans demonstrated a patience and endurance born not from improvisation, but from an industrial backbone that the Germans could scarcely comprehend. Trucks rolled continuously along mud-slick roads, columns of jeeps and tanks traversed shattered villages, and artillery positions received steady resupply. Every attempt to predict or disrupt these movements failed. To the captured officers, the battlefield no longer seemed governed solely by skill or courage. It was dominated by the Americans' ability to harness industry and logistics, turning what should have been a tactical equilibrium into a relentless, unyielding pressure. Witnessing the operational efficiency of the Americans had a profound effect on morale. Many German officers admitted in post-war accounts that the sight of organized, well-fed, and equipped troops advancing without apparent fatigue undermined their confidence. Their own men were exhausted, short on ammunition, and demoralized by the inability to halt the American advance. The psychological shock of observing soldiers who could seemingly operate indefinitely with full supplies created an impression that the war was no longer a contest of valor alone. The unbroken convoys symbolized more than material advantage. They were a visible manifestation of industrial power, discipline, and national will. The American logistical system was unprecedented in scale and precision. Thousands of miles of roads, repaired and maintained under fire, funneled trucks carrying essential fuel, food, and ammunition to frontline units. Engineers constructed temporary bridges overnight, allowing convoys to bypass destroyed infrastructure. Depots in Brittany and Cherbourg acted as hubs for rapid redistribution of resources. Each convoy was part of a synchronized network where timing, priority, and capacity were meticulously calculated. German officers, schooled in the limitations of European supply lines, found the sheer redundancy and adaptability staggering. Supply was no longer a constraint. It was a weapon in its own right. Technology enhanced the efficiency of this system. Radio communications linked supply officers with infantry, artillery, and armored units, ensuring requests were met before shortages became critical. Trucks and armored carriers standardized for repair and maintenance minimized downtime. Fuel was stockpiled and transported in protected pipelines when possible. This integration of communication, transportation, and engineering meant that American forces could sustain prolonged operations far beyond what German commanders expected. Every mechanical innovation and organizational decision amplified the Americans' combat effectiveness, leaving the Axis struggling to find exploitable weaknesses. Finally, the captured officers witnessed a unique synergy between human effort and industrial output. Soldiers fought not only with weapons, but with the confidence that their next meal, ammunition, and reinforcements were assured. Factories and engineers far from the front lines directly influenced battlefield outcomes. The Axis realization was stark. In modern warfare, raw bravery and tactical acumen were insufficient without an industrial and logistical backbone capable of maintaining relentless pressure. This revelation reshaped German understanding of total war and foreshadowed the strategic outcomes that would follow in the European theater. The combination of unyielding human spirit, technological integration, and industrial might left an indelible impression on the captured officers, crystallizing the reality that the war in Normandy was as much a struggle of supply and endurance as of bullets and tanks. By mid-July 1944, the Normandy beaches had long since become a distant memory, but the battle for France had intensified into a grinding contest of attrition. American forces pushed inland from Omaha and Utah beaches, while the Germans struggled to regroup, their lines stretched thin across the Bocage countryside. Roads churned into mud by endless convoys, artillery fire echoing through shattered villages, smoke rising from shell-torn fields. For the captured German officers, observing these operations firsthand offered a stark, undeniable reality. The Americans' logistical supremacy had transformed the battlefield. Every day, convoys appeared without pause, trucks, jeeps, armored carriers, and mobile artillery rolling in synchronized patterns. Engineers repaired bridges overnight. Field kitchens served hundreds of soldiers without delay. German officers, still bound and transported under guard, took notes, whispered reports of astonishment filtering back to their units. They documented not only the relentless flow of materiel, but also the well-rested, well-fed soldiers moving with unwavering morale. It was a theater of war unlike any they had experienced, one where the combination of human endurance and industrial might seemed invincible. On July 20th, 1944, during the push toward St. Lo, These officers observed American infantry advancing alongside Sherman tanks, supported by P-47 Thunderbolts overhead. Smoke plumes marked the locations of freshly destroyed fortifications, yet supply lines remained uninterrupted. The Germans attempted counterattacks, but the Americans' ability to replace losses overnight and maintain continuous pressure left every maneuver ultimately inconsequential. In private notes, one captured officer wrote of the terrifying efficiency of the American system, recognizing that courage alone could no longer secure victory when faced with such inexhaustible support. The turning point crystallized in the mind of these officers during a visit to a forward supply depot near Cherbourg. Mountains of ammunition, fuel barrels, and rations stretched across fields under the protection of hastily constructed fortifications. Soldiers moved with disciplined precision, guided by radios and officers coordinating every movement. For the Germans, it was a revelation. The battlefield was no longer defined solely by guns and tactics, but by the capacity to feed, fuel, and arm a fighting force faster than the enemy could destroy it. This insight reshaped their understanding of modern warfare, revealing the strategic depth of American industrial power and the inevitability of sustained Allied advances. By July's end, the reality was undeniable. German forces were not only being defeated tactically, but strategically outmaneuvered by an opponent whose supply chain had become a weapon itself. The captured officers internalized a lesson that would haunt German command for the remainder of the campaign. The Normandy battlefield was no longer merely contested, it was being systematically overwhelmed by the seamless integration of logistics, engineering, and human endurance. As the Americans advanced, the German officers realized that what they faced was not just a series of battles, but an industrial juggernaut, an unrelenting force that had redefined the rules of warfare and rendered traditional notions of military supremacy obsolete. Their accounts highlighted not only operational efficiency, but also the psychological edge it gave the Americans. Confidence, morale, and the ability to maintain a relentless tempo across hundreds of kilometers of frontline terrain became a force multiplier, rendering German counterattacks increasingly futile. The officers' journals, letters, and post-war memoirs repeatedly reference one striking observation. The Americans' endless convoy lines were more terrifying than any gunfire. In the end, the captured German officers at Normandy bore witness to a paradigm shift in modern warfare. The battle was lost not solely on the battlefield, but in the arteries of supply, in the engine rooms of factories, and along the miles of American convoys that never seemed to stop. Normandy was a stark illustration that in total war, industrial might and logistical mastery could decide the fate of nations as decisively as any battle. The story of German officers captured at Normandy is more than a tale of battlefield defeat. It is a study of the invisible engines that power modern war. Amid the mud, smoke, and shattered villages, these men saw firsthand how an industrialized society could translate assembly lines, trucks, and fuel depots into a weapon as decisive as any tank or artillery piece. The endless American convoys, moving with relentless rhythm across liberated France, became symbols of a new kind of warfare, one in which human courage alone could no longer secure victory. Their observations illuminate a fundamental truth of World War II. Battles were fought not only with bullets and shells, but with planning, coordination, and supply. Normandy was a crucible where the limitations of the German war effort were exposed against a foe whose strength lay as much in logistical mastery as in combat power. By seeing the efficiency of American operations, these officers gained an unfiltered perspective on the scale of their nation's disadvantage. Factories cranked out tanks while roads funneled men and materials forward with astonishing speed. Every bridge repaired, every rail line cleared, every fuel depot stocked reinforced a psychological and operational momentum that German forces could not match. Beyond military mechanics, the human element resonated deeply. Prisoners saw that the Allies, even in victory, adhered to order, discipline, and humane treatment. Soldiers received care. Civilians, protection. This contrast challenged preconceived notions of enmity, reminding the captured officers and modern audiences that warfare, though violent, could still respect ethical boundaries. Ultimately, Normandy's captured officers serve as a lens into the broader lessons of World War II. The war was not merely a series of heroic engagements, but a vast orchestration of people, industry, and strategy. It was a reminder that resilience, foresight, and resourcefulness could shape outcomes as profoundly as courage on the battlefield. Their accounts leave us reflecting not just on defeat or victory, but on the extraordinary capacity of human organization to overcome adversity and redefine the very nature of warfare. In the quiet aftermath, the endless convoy lines of Normandy became a metaphor. The steady, unseen forces of preparation and logistics could outlast the fleeting brilliance of tactical genius, shaping history in ways that reverberate long after the guns fall silent.